Between 1939 and 1945, roughly 70 million people died. That number is so vast, it collapses into abstraction, a figure printed in textbooks, repeated in documentaries, stripped of all human weight by sheer repetition. But every single one of those deaths had a mechanism: a bullet, a blast wave, a piece of shrapnel no larger than a coin, traveling faster than sound. The Second World War was not merely a conflict of ideologies or nations. It was the largest laboratory of organized killing the world had ever seen, and the instruments it produced were designed with a single, unwavering purpose: to end human life as efficiently, as relentlessly, and as cheaply as possible. To understand the weapons that define this war, we must first understand the world that built them. The generation that marched into the Second World War was the first in human history to be entirely shaped by industrial civilization. And the factories that had spent 2 decades producing automobiles, radios, sewing machines, and canned food could, within months, be retooled to produce tanks, ammunition, and explosives on a scale that would have seemed hallucinatory to any general of the previous century. By 1943, the United States alone was manufacturing 1 aircraft every 5 minutes. The Soviet Union produced over 100,000 T-34 tanks before the war's end. Germany's industrial output, even under relentless Allied bombing, continued to rise until the final months of 1944. This was a war fought not just by soldiers, but by entire economies, and the weapons those soldiers carried were the physical expression of that industrial might. But there was something else, something inherited. The First World War had ended only 21 years earlier, and its lessons had not been forgotten. The trenches of Verdun and the Somme had revealed a terrifying truth. Modern weapons had outpaced modern tactics. Machine guns had turned open ground into a killing field. Artillery had churned entire landscapes into unrecognizable mud. Poison gas had introduced a horror so indiscriminate that even the nations that deployed it recoiled. In 1916, on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, nearly 20,000 of them killed, in a single sunrise to sunset period. The generals and engineers of the 1930s had grown up in the shadow of that arithmetic. And they had spent 2 decades asking a single relentless question: how do we make killing faster, more precise, and more mobile? What the interwar period produced was not new categories of weapons, but radical refinements of existing ones: lighter, faster, more portable, more lethal. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, and restricted to an army of just 100,000 men, poured its limited resources into qualitative superiority. Every soldier was trained as a potential officer. Instead, every weapon was designed to outperform its equivalent in any other army. Japan invested heavily in naval aviation and torpedo technology. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's 5-year plans, built an industrial base from almost nothing, transforming a largely agrarian nation into the world's second-largest arms producer by 1939. The arms race was not a metaphor. It was an industrial program with budgets, timelines, and measurable outputs. The irony was profound. The same scientific method, the same rational engineering, the same organizational genius that had improved sanitation and doubled life expectancy was now being applied with equal rigor to the problem of ending life. And when the war came, those outputs arrived on the battlefield with devastating precision. Then the scale revealed itself. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the campaign lasted 5 weeks. When France fell in 1940, it took 6. And the speed of these early conquests masked something profound. This war would not be fought on a single front, or even 2. It would span from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of North Africa, from the jungles of Burma to the volcanic islands of the Pacific. It would be fought in cities, in forests, in snow, in mud, underwater, and in the air. And each of these environments demanded weapons adapted to its specific horrors. And the result was an explosion of lethal innovation unmatched in human history. Of all the weapons a soldier could encounter on the battlefields of the Second World War, few inspired more immediate terror than the German MG-42. Officially designated the Maschinengewehr 42, this weapon represented a fundamental rethinking of what a machine gun could be. Its rate of fire was staggering. between 1,200 and 1,500 rounds per minute. That is 20 to 25 bullets per second. The human ear could not distinguish individual shots. What soldiers heard instead was a single continuous ripping sound, a tearing fabric of noise that earned the weapon its allied nickname, Hitler's buzzsaw. American troops called it the bone saw. Soviet soldiers simply called it the linoleum ripper. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. Entire squads would freeze at the sound, pinned behind whatever cover they could find, all knowing that raising a head above a wall or a ridge meant near certain death. The MG42 was also remarkably simple to manufacture, stamped metal parts rather than precision machined components, which meant Germany could produce them in enormous quantities even as its industrial base crumbled. A trained crew could change an overheated barrel in under 6 seconds. The weapon was so effective that after the war, its design was studied, adapted, and essentially replicated by NATO forces. The American M60 and the German Bundeswehr's MG3 are both direct descendants. But for the soldiers who faced it, the MG42 was not an engineering achievement. It was a sound that meant someone nearby was about to die. As automatic weapons dominated open terrain, a different horror awaited those who fought in confined spaces. The flamethrower was not new to the Second World War. Germany had deployed the Flammenwerfer in the trenches of 1915, but the technology had matured into something far more reliable and far more terrifying. The American M2 flamethrower, standard issue for the Pacific Theater, could project a stream of thickened fuel up to 40 meters. The fuel, a sticky napalm-based gel, clung to surfaces and to skin. It burned at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius. There was no way to extinguish it quickly. The weapon was designed for one specific tactical purpose, clearing fortified positions that conventional weapons could not reach. In the Pacific, Japanese forces constructed elaborate networks of bunkers, caves, and tunnels carved into volcanic rock and reinforced with concrete. Grenades bounced off walls. Rifle fire was absorbed by angles and shadows, but fire filled every space. It consumed the oxygen in enclosed tunnels. It reached around corners. During the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945, flamethrower teams became the spearhead of nearly every bunker assault. The Marines called it blowtorching. The men who carried these weapons bore an extraordinary burden. Not only were they priority targets for enemy fire, since the fuel tanks on their backs could detonate if struck by a single incendiary round, but they also carried the psychological weight of what the weapon did. While many flamethrower operators requested transfers after a single engagement, veterans rarely spoke about it afterward. The flamethrower did not merely kill, it erased. While fire cleared bunkers above ground, another weapon waited silently beneath it. The anti-personnel mine was perhaps the most psychologically corrosive weapon of the entire war, precisely because it required no human operator. It simply waited. The German S-mine, designated Shrapnel Mine 35 and universally known to Allied soldiers as the Bouncing Betty, was a masterpiece of cruel engineering. When triggered by a pressure plate or a tripwire, a small propellant charge launched the mine's body roughly 1 meter into the air. At waist height, it detonated, spraying 360 steel ball bearings in every direction at lethal velocity. The kill radius was approximately 20 meters. The wounding radius extended far beyond that. What made the S-mine uniquely terrifying was not just its lethality, but its psychological architecture. Soldiers who survived an S-mine encounter described the distinctive click of the launch charge, a half-second pause between the click and the explosion, just long enough to understand what was happening, but not long enough to do anything about it. Germany produced over 1.9 million S-mines during the war. They were buried along beaches, in fields, on roadsides, in the approaches to every defensive position. During the D-Day landings at Normandy, entire sections of Omaha and Utah Beach were seeded with them, mixed among wooden stakes and steel obstacles designed to rip open landing craft. Soldiers learned to walk in the footprints of the man ahead. Mine-sweeping teams, often working on their hands and knees with bayonets and bare fingers, probed the earth inch by inch. The mine turned the ground itself into an enemy, and the enemy multiplied. Booby traps became a standard tactic on every front. Retreating forces wired doorknobs, rigged corpses, placed explosives under attractive souvenirs left on tables. In North Africa, German engineers developed the practice of mining their own minefields, placing anti-handling devices beneath S-mines so that the mine would detonate when a sapper attempted to disarm it. In the Pacific, Japanese forces concealed grenades beneath the bodies of their own fallen soldiers, knowing that American troops would attempt to recover dog tags and identification. The grenade itself, compact, portable, requiring no skill beyond the ability to pull a pin and throw, was the most democratic weapon of the war. Every soldier carried them. The American Mark II fragmentation grenade, with its distinctive pineapple-shaped casing, produced lethal fragments across a 15-meter radius. The German steel hand granite, the stick grenade known to Allied soldiers as the potato masher, all could be thrown farther due to its long handle, but carried a smaller fragmentation charge. In the close quarters fighting of Stalingrad and the Pacific Islands, grenades were sometimes the only weapon that could reach an enemy behind a wall or inside a bunker. They were thrown through windows, rolled down stairwells, tossed into tunnels. The sound of a grenade spoon releasing a sharp metallic ping became one of the most dreaded sounds in infantry combat. But for all the industrial sophistication of machine guns and mines and flamethrowers, the Second World War also produced moments of combat so close that technology ceased to matter entirely. In the rubble of Stalingrad, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the jungle fighting of Guadalcanal and Peleliu, soldiers fought at distances measured in meters, sometimes inches. At this range, the weapons were ancient in concept, if not in form. The bayonet, mounted on the end of a rifle, was chaotic, frantic, and profoundly intimate. During the Japanese defense of Okinawa, banzai charges, massed infantry assaults with fixed bayonets, became a recurring nightmare for American Marines, who often had only seconds to respond before the attackers were upon them. Soviet soldiers at Stalingrad, fighting room to room through the shattered remains of apartment buildings and factories, often resorted to sharpened entrenching tools, small folding shovels designed for digging foxholes. The entrenching tool was short, fast, and devastatingly effective in confined spaces where a rifle was too long to maneuver. Soviet training manuals from 1942 onward included specific techniques for its use as a close-quarters weapon, and veterans of the Stalingrad fighting would later describe it as more reliable than any firearm in the dark, debris-choked corridors of the Barricadi factory complex. Specialized close combat knives proliferated across every army. The American Mark I trench knife, with its brass knuckle grip and double-edged blade, was designed for a single purpose. The British Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, developed by two Shanghai police officers who had studied knife combat in the criminal underworld of pre-war China, became the standard-issue weapon for commandos and special forces. The Soviet NR-40, with its distinctive curved guard, was mass-produced by the millions. Each of these weapons was designed specifically for killing at arm's length, and each left no distance between the person wielding it and the person it struck. Then veterans of close combat universally described it as the most traumatic experience of the war, more psychologically damaging than artillery bombardment or aerial bombing, because it eliminated the one thing that made industrial killing bearable: abstraction. You saw the face. You heard the breath. The industrialization of killing had, in these moments, circled back to something profoundly primitive. Yet, for all the horror of close combat and the terror of mines and flamethrowers, none of these weapons killed the most soldiers. That distinction belonged to something far less dramatic in appearance, but incomparably more destructive in effect: artillery. Across all theaters of the Second World War, artillery and mortar fire accounted for an estimated 58 to 75% of all battlefield casualties. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. A single German 88mm shell, originally designed as an anti-aircraft weapon and repurposed with lethal versatility against tanks, bunkers, and infantry alike, could destroy an armored vehicle or kill every occupant of a fortified position from over a kilometer away. The 88 became so feared that Allied soldiers developed a specific dread for its flat, high-velocity crack, a sound distinct from any other gun on the battlefield. But the most psychologically devastating artillery weapon belonged to the Soviet Union. In the Katyusha rocket launcher, a battery of rails mounted on the back of a truck could fire up to 48 rockets in a single salvo, saturating an area the size of several football fields with high explosives in under 10 seconds. The sound was unlike anything in nature, a shrieking, howling wail that earned it the nickname Stalin's organ. German soldiers who survived Katyusha barrages described a landscape afterward that no longer resembled the earth. Trees shredded to stumps, or trenches collapsed, bodies scattered in pieces across hundreds of meters. During the Battle of Berlin in April 1945, the Soviet Union concentrated over 40,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers along a 60-mile front. The bombardment that preceded the final assault consumed over 1.2 million shells in a single day. The ground shook continuously for hours. Buildings did not collapse, they disintegrated. Artillery was not glamorous, and it rarely appeared in propaganda posters or heroic narratives. But it was the war's true killing machine, indiscriminate and absolute. The infantryman who survived a mortar barrage was not brave, he was lucky. The difference between life and death was often nothing more than 3 meters of lateral distance, the space between the blast radius and survival. As the war ground toward its conclusion, desperation drove innovation in darker directions still. Germany, facing inevitable defeat, channeled its remaining resources into weapons designed not to win battles, but to terrorize entire civilian populations. The V-1 flying bomb, launched from occupied France and the Low Countries, was the world's first cruise missile, a pilotless aircraft carrying 850 kilograms of high explosive, guided by a simple autopilot and a mechanical counter that measured distance by counting propeller revolutions. When the counter reached 0, the engine cut out. The silence was the warning. Londoners learned to listen for the distinctive buzzing of the V-1's pulse jet engine and to fear the moment it stopped. Over 10,000 V-1s were launched at Britain. Roughly 2,400 reached London, killing over 6,000 people. But the V-1 was merely a prelude. The V-2, operational from September 1944, was something the world had never seen. A liquid-fueled ballistic missile traveling at over 3,500 kilometers per hour, faster than the speed of sound. There was no warning, no air raid siren, and no buzzing engine. The explosion arrived before the sound. You heard nothing, and then the building next to you ceased to exist. Over 3,000 V-2s were launched at Allied targets, killing approximately 9,000 civilians and military personnel. But the weapon carried a second, hidden cost: the forced laborers who built it. The V-2 was assembled primarily at the Mittelwerk underground factory by prisoners from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. An estimated 20,000 laborers died during its production, more people than the rocket killed in combat. The weapon's legacy was profound and deeply contradictory. The engineers who built it, led by Werner von Braun, were captured by American forces and brought to the United States, where their expertise formed the foundation of the American space program. The same rocket engine that rained death on London would, 25 years later, carry human beings to the moon. The line between weapon and achievement was, as always, disturbingly thin. The Second World War ended in August 1945 with a weapon that rendered all others obsolete in a single flash. But the weapons that came before, the machine guns, the flamethrowers, the mines, the bayonets, the artillery, the rockets, had already reshaped our understanding of what human beings were willing to do to one another. The war produced no single villain weapon. It produced an entire ecosystem of lethality. In each instrument filling a niche in the ecology of destruction, the MG-42 for suppression, the flamethrower for clearance, the mine for denial, the blade for the final desperate meters, the artillery shell for everything in between. What linked them was not their mechanism, but their scale. Every weapon of the Second World War was a product of industrial civilization turned fully and deliberately toward annihilation. The same assembly lines, the same engineering precision, the same organizational genius that had produced the automobile and the radio now produced instruments whose sole purpose was to tear human bodies apart. The trade-off is stark and uncomfortable. The technologies that emerged from this war Jet propulsion, radar, nuclear energy, rocketry, antibiotics rushed into mass production, synthetic materials, computing, form the foundation of the modern world. Our satellites, our air travel, our medical infrastructure, our digital networks all carry the genetic code of wartime innovation. We live in the world that these weapons built, a world whose comforts are inseparable from the catastrophe that produced them. The factories are quiet now, most of them at least, but the designs survive in archives, in museums, in the memories of those few who remain. And in every conflict since, in every theater where a mine waits beneath the soil or a rocket traces its